and Facebook, and we are thrilled to have you join us on World Social Justice Day for Solitary Confinement, a Human Rights Crisis in the United States. Don't forget to follow along with hashtag UnlockTheBoxNow and hashtag World Social Justice Day. Share your comments and thoughts throughout the event. I'd like to shout out the co-sponsors of this program, Human Rights Watch and Unlock the Box, a national campaign against solitary confinement. Please drop your questions or comments in the chat on whichever platform you're watching. We're excited to see what you think as we move through this important conversation. With that, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Patrice Sultan. I run an organization in Washington, D.C. called DC Justice Lab, where we feel strongly that it is impossible to solve violence with more violence. And one of the most horrific practices in our criminal legal system that is directly driving mass incarceration is the practice of solitary confinement in prisons and jails. Though hidden away, solitary confinement impacts all of us in ways that we'll get to talk about and learn more about today through our tremendous panel of experts. And the truth is that although this is a human rights crisis unique to the United States, it has fueled mass incarceration for decades. If I could turn your attention to our panel of experts, I'd like to give each of them a moment to introduce themselves and tell you about the work that they've done and what they've survived. I'd like to start with Allison Leal Parker from the U.S. Program of Human Rights Watch.
Thank you so much, Patrice. It's a real honor to be here today with you and with my co-panelists. And you asked about my personal experience with solitary and to introduce myself. And the two are very connected. I'm the U.S. Program Deputy Director at Human Rights Watch. And my experience with the subject comes through my work because I've traveled throughout the United States. I've been at Human Rights Watch for 23 years. I've been in juvenile facilities where people have been locked up in solitary confinement. I've talked to hundreds of people in immigration detention facilities throughout the U.S. who've been subjected to solitary confinement, locked up for 22 hours in a day in their cells. And also hundreds of people in U.S. prisons who I have met with for hours and hours to understand their experience in U.S. prisons, where again, solitary confinement is a regular practice. So again, it's an honor to be with you, and I look forward to the conversation.
I am also privileged to be here in this panel, and I want to thank Unlock the Box and Human Rights Watch for inviting me. My name is Juan Mendez, and I was the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture between 2010 and 2016. My predecessors and my successors in that job and myself paid a lot of attention to solitary confinement. And we have promoted reform from international human rights law of this practice because under certain conditions, it does meet the definition of torture or of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment. And after although I'm no longer the Special Rapporteur on Torture, I continue to take every opportunity I can to join other people in campaigning against this very horrific kind of mental torture.
Thank you, Juan. I'd like to turn next to Anissa Sabur from Unlock the Box and New York's Halt Solitary campaign.
Thank you so much, Patrice. And I am very much honored to be on this panel with our distinguished guest. So my name is Anissa Sabur. I am the national coordinator for the Unlock the Box campaign. I'm also a member of the Halt Solitary campaign, and I am a solitary survivor. And I just want to say thank you for allowing me to join in this conversation because of my own lived experiences, as well as my prison monitoring experiences in talking to folks who have experienced solitary confinement and bringing their issues to light as well. So thank you.
Thank you for being with us. And last but not least, Dr. Terry Cooper is one of the leading research on the psychological effects of solitary. Could you please tell us a little bit about who you are?
Thank you. Like Anissa, I am honored to be among this group of warriors to end what I consider torture, solitary confinement. I'm a psychiatrist. I do general psychiatry, community mental health. Early in my career, I was asked to do a class action lawsuit at the Los Angeles Men's Central Jail about the conditions and the presence of a lot of people with serious mental illness. I walked into the jail because, most things that go on in jail and prison are extremely secret. The outside doesn't know what's going on. The press are not allowed in. Visits and phone calls are restricted. So I walked in and I was horrified. I had been treating people at state mental hospitals at UCLA, where I was in training, with serious mental illness. But what I found in the jail was an immense number of people who were acutely psychotic and acting out and screaming. The population was almost entirely Black and Latinx, which shocked me. It didn't represent the community at all. And there were horrible abuses going on, including solitary confinement. I became a forensic psychiatrist and have testified in many cases. The thing about testifying as an expert is that I have to do an investigation. So the court orders that the jails or prisons being sued must let me and the other experts and the lawyers in. So we see something that the rest of the population just doesn't know anything about. And first of all, I'm horrified what I see, and we'll talk about some of that today. But second of all, I feel a duty to come out and report to the public, not only by testifying in court, but then I publish, I speak, like at this panel. I have written quite a bit. One book is Solitary, the Inside Story of Solitary Isolated Confinement and How We Can Abolish It. And I'm very happy to be part of this campaign. I think Dostoevsky was right. If you want to know about a society, look in its prisons. If you look inside American prisons, you will see torture in many forms, but one of the worst and consistently torturous experiences is solitary confinement.
We so appreciate all four of you for being here to help us peer behind the wall and understand what is happening inside these facilities. Okay, so we are going to quickly bust some commonly held myths about solitary confinement. And starting with Dr. Cooper's, I'm finding in my work that many people believe solitary confinement is used as a last resort in the most extreme circumstances or for the very worst of the worst who pose an immediate threat to corrections staff. And I was wondering if you could share with us a little bit about how solitary confinement is actually being used, how often and widespread we see this practice. And I'd love to hear from others from there.
I'd be happy to. You're absolutely right. It's far from the worst of the worst who are consigned to solitary confinement. 85% of the people in solitary confinement in the United States are put in solitary for minor infractions. Solitary is an extremely harsh punishment, but people get solitary confinement, for instance, for having ibuprofen pills that are expired, which are then called contraband by the custody officers. And they're put in solitary confinement or crossing a line or getting upset with an officer. The punishment is solitary confinement for 15 days or a month or something like that. But then what happens is that people break down in solitary. They have psychiatric symptoms, including massive anxiety and agitation, a lot of anger, and in some interaction with an officer, they get upset. And the officer feels that they insulted them or didn't follow an order, and they give them a longer time in solitary. So people go into solitary with a minor charge and end up spending months or years. And that's torture, long-term solitary confinement. 30% of youth are in solitary confinement. It's called room confinement or out of community in various states. And that's because the staff are not well paid, not well trained, and not particularly sensitive to the children that they're taking care of. So they get into a dispute with the child goes to solitary confinement. It's the worst thing to do, which we'll talk about more. it's punitive solitary confinement that I was talking about with the minor rule infractions. But solitary is also used during investigations of crime, and it's called administrative segregation, or it's used to protect people. Now, in corrections, protective custody, by all standards, is not supposed to involve isolation. The person who is at risk must be kept safe. And so they must be separated from people who will assault them. However, the separation should include the amenities and the programs that they're entitled to because of their security level. In most jails and prisons in the United States, that rule is violated across the board. And people who need protection are put in solitary confinement, which then causes massive emotional breakdown. Examples. Rape is epidemic in American prisons and jails. In men's prisons, it's a fight between prisoners. Somebody rapes somebody. In women's prisons, it's the staff who sexually assault the women. If a woman complains of being sexually assaulted by staff, she is sent to solitary confinement. Most women and most incidents of sexual assault are not reported because the women are so terrified of going to solitary confinement. For one thing, it means they won't see their children. They won't have visits with their children. So they don't report the sexual assault. Or one of the executive orders President Trump instituted immediately upon being inaugurated is that trans folks have to go to the prison, and they're overrepresented in prison because of discrimination in our society, but they go to the prison of their biological sex. Trans women are raped in men's prisons. Something like 59% of trans women in men's prisons, research shows, are sexually abused by other men. Therefore, they need to be in a women's facility. And by making the rule that there's only biological sex, there's no such thing as gender, that means that trans women will be in men's prisons and vulnerable. And the alternative is going to be solitary confinement, which causes emotional breakdown. So it's a choice between being sexually abused or being tortured and having emotional breakdowns. There's also solitary confinement by other names. For instance, lockdowns. When a prison is locked down because they're investigating after violence, everybody's in solitary confinement, and that can go on for many months. One of the groups of people I find in solitary is very, very intelligent and very socially conscious people who did their crimes when they were a teenager or a young adult. They've been spending their years straightening out their act. They've gotten themselves educated. They're very well schooled in philosophy and social science. I have very intelligent conversations with them. And I say, why are you here? And many of them will say, well, I got into an argument with a guard because I was reading the rules and the guard was punishing me for a rule that didn't exist, and he had the rule book wrong. So I argued with him. He hit me and he put me in solitary confinement. So there's a way that people who speak truth to power find their way into solitary confinement. Race has a lot to do with it. If it's a white officer and a black prisoner, that prisoner is going to be beaten and put in solitary confinement. So there's a quick roundup of.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coopers. You know, it's easy to go through our day without being cognizant of exactly how many human lives are incarcerated. And so when we talk in terms of percentages, I just want to put a finer point on how many people we're talking about in solitary confinement at any given moment in the United States. It's over 120,000 human lives that we're talking about in the course of this conversation. And when we think about the scale and the magnitude of that, we might think that that means it's not as bad as what we're making it out to be. And so I'd really like Juan to speak more to why is this something that's been classified as torture? If it's that widespread, how could it possibly be that bad?
Yes, thank you. Well, I would add to what Dr. Cooper said that there's another category that troubles me, and that is First, that people who act out, quote unquote, are put in solitary confinement as a prison management kind of idea. So in effect, people who are suffering some kind of breakdown are put in solitary confinement. Where of course this is going to aggravate the problem. But the other category that I think we should bear in mind is those people who are accused of terrorism activities, particularly transnational terrorism, who are brought to the United States. When they are brought to the United States, are put in pretrial solitary confinement, sometimes for months or even years, until they plead guilty. And then when they are found guilty of terrorism, the way they serve their term in maximum security prisons is also in solitary confinement. So I think that's one aspect of what goes on in the United States that I just wanted to add to the very comprehensive way that Dr. Cooper's answered your question. With respect to comparisons with the rest of the world, solitary confinement is more extended in the rest of the world than we had ever thought of. But in most countries, even though it's excessive and long-term and indefinite, it is relatively less frequent, or proportionally used more as an extraordinary recourse. Whereas in the United States, as you well put it, we're talking about literally tens of thousands of people, 120,000 at any given day, put in solitary confinement in the United States. And it does spread. It's a bad example to the rest of the world, where countries are using it more extensively and for different purposes, including countries like China that use it for it's a way of the execution of a sentence in a serious crime. In China and in Japan, if you're convicted of a serious violent crime, you actually serve your term in solitary confinement. And even in countries that have much more benign correctional regimes like the Scandinavian countries, it's used when investigating a crime that has several different defendants, to isolate them from each other during pretrial detention. And otherwise, it is regulated and it's controlled by judges, etc. But it can be, even in Scandinavia, it can last a year or more in solitary confinement.
And I want to better understand when isolation amounts to torture. Could you share with us what the UN's perspective is on that question?
Yes, thank you. I want to stress that this is from the legal perspective and this present state of international law. And the present state of international law says that the Convention Against Torture defines torture as the deliberate infliction of pain or suffering of a certain gravity by a state agent. And the pain and suffering can be either physical or mental or psychological, which under all these circumstances, solitary confinement meets the definition. But there are some lawful uses of solitary confinement as an extreme measure to avoid violence inside custody, etc. As long as it's short term, as long as it's surrounded by guarantees of due process, so you can actually challenge the decision and get an independent, impartial decision on it. And also, as long as it's not used against certain categories of prisoners, even for very short terms. For example, pregnant women and breastfeeding women, children, that is anybody under 18 years of age, and persons suffering from any mental disability or psychosocial disability. So, and in addition to that, even for people who are adults and safe and not suffering from mental disabilities, international law prohibits what is called indefinite solitary confinement, that is when you don't know when it's going to end, or prolonged solitary confinement, which is defined in the Nelson Mandela rules from 2015, and also in another instrument called the Istanbul Statement on Abuses of Solitary Confinement, is defined as any period beyond 15 days. So on those terms, if a prison regulations of a country or of a state in the United States or the federal government or of any other country establishes the possibility of imposing a disciplinary sanction of 30 days, for example, they are beyond the limits imposed by international law, and by definition that becomes cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment, or in more severe stages, and of course the longer the term goes, it becomes torture.
So, picking up on what you said about due process, I think it's really important for people to appreciate that the lack of transparency and the lack of process really can become a mechanism for abuses in our system to be covered up. It isn't just about wanting to make sure that somebody has an opportunity to be heard. We need to be able to see and understand what's going on if we want to protect people from the kinds of horrific abuses we know are happening at a large scale in a lot of places across the country. Um, when we think about solitary confinement being this prolonged period of time, weeks, months, years, decades, in many instances, not rarely, we have to imagine what kind of toll that's taking, not just on the person who's in the space the size of a parking space, but on all of us and on our collective humanity. What does that really mean when we're saying that we can do something that violent to another person without even talking about it first?
If I can add just a thought here, one section of what Mr. Mendez was commenting about is mental illness. My research has been how solitary confinement causes human breakdown. The breakdown we call mental or psychiatric, but it also goes along with changes in the brain, which can make it more permanent. Absolutely stable people have massive symptoms, including anxiety, agitation, paranoia, trouble thinking, memory problems. They pace in their cells. They have massive despair. The prevalence of suicide is massive. Half of the suicides that occur in correctional settings happen in solitary confinement, where there's only on average 5% of the prison population. Then, for people with serious mental illness already, and they are selectively sent to solitary because custody staff doesn't know what to do with their inappropriate behaviors, or they have trouble following the rules, or what's most common is they're victimized. And for instance, they get into a fight. Everybody involved in the fight is put in solitary. So they're in solitary. It hugely exacerbates their mental illness. And that's why people with mental illness are excluded from solitary in the UN standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners.
Thank you. Anissa, as someone who is working hard to eliminate this practice in the United States, I want to better understand what that looks like. What does it mean to ban solitary confinement? Can you help us understand the definition of what it means to end torture?
It means life. It means living. It means saving human lives. So, the two panelists before me spoke really in depth about the impact that it has on human lives. But one thing they didn't talk about was how many folks literally lose their lives in solitary confinement. These are some of the well-kept secrets across our country that people on a daily basis are not only mutilating themselves and causing all types of harm to themselves because of being in solitary confinement, but are actually taking their own lives. We're losing young people, old people, people with disabilities. The number of people who have died just in New York State alone in our solitary confinement jails and prisons is horrifying. And so for me, for someone who was able to live through it, to be able to better understand the real impact, this is why I fight to end it. Because we don't need to lose not one more life, not one human life. Because people were charged and convicted of a crime and are incarcerated, but they were not sentenced to die. Putting people in solitary confinement gives them a death sentence. And Dr. Cooper, you talked about due processes, right? One of the things that New York State fought for in their law was to make sure that when people are charged inside, that they have representation, somebody who understands the laws, the actual, what they call directives of our correctional systems, the laws that they claim that individuals break to get them into solitary, to help them help people understand that it's not always a law or a rule that has been broken, so that people don't have to suffer in isolation. So this for me is personal because I didn't break a rule. So I know what it is to be locked down 23 hours out of the day without folks actually saying that I committed an offense. I committed my offense to become incarcerated. I have no doubt with that. I speak to that. Yes, I did. But to be put in isolation, I literally absolutely did not break any directive, regulation, policy, or anything towards the Department of Corrections. Dr. Cooper said it. It's just saying no to an officer. And it wasn't that I was saying no to a rule. I just didn't want to talk. If Dr. Cooper would have came and talked to me, it might have been something that actually I would wanted to do because he is a psychiatrist, right? He would probably help me kind of talk about the emotions that was actually happening at that moment for me. But an officer don't have that kind of, I don't even know what to call it, but it just wasn't that kind of conversation or a conversation I wanted to have with someone of authority who could not even help me, right? And so I want people to understand that when you're put in isolation, you can be in there for anywhere up to 24 complete hours. Because the rule says 23 hours, 1 hour of recreation. But when you're put out into outside elements, the weather, they don't care what it could be 100 degrees, it could be 0 degrees. You are put outside into the elements for that 1 hour. And once you're out for that hour, you stay there. But actually, solitary confinement is just truly isolation. And within that isolation comes the torture, right? Like Dr. Cooper said, the psychological breakdown. And then the officers' interactions, when you do have interactions with them, is always a negative. So that piles on to your time. So yeah, so solitary confinement is torture. It will always be torture. And as long as Anissa have breath in her body, I will fight to end it.
Thank you. One thing I'm hearing in that answer is that we're not just talking about harm or suffering. We're talking in many cases about permanent harm, permanent suffering, and irreversible damage to human lives. And I appreciate you spelling that out for us. Is there anything that you want to add about the definition of solitary confinement as a takeaway for people who want to share that definition with others who want to learn more?
Solitary confinement definition is torture. It is 23 to 24 hours of isolation. It ain't lockdown, it's isolation. And it's used across this country too often on Black and brown bodies. And we need to end it, and we need to end it now.
I'm picking up on more than one form of torture in the comments I've heard so far. There is isolation and the deprivation of meaningful human interaction. And then there is the confinement to a cell for an extended period of time. And I'm glad that that was highlighted because sometimes we will see people held in a cell for 23 hours a day or 22 hours a day with another person. And the Department of Corrections here will pretend that that's not solitary confinement just because it was two to a cell. And there certainly are lifelong consequences and irreparable harms that result from the confinement and itself as much as with isolation. Just imagine being in a cell the size of a parking space with another person. I think it's hard for any of us to pretend that that's not torture just because there's another person there. And that prolonged confinement, that prolonged lockdown is torture, and it should be treated as a form of should be regarded as a form of solitary confinement as well. We're here gathered on World Social Justice Day, and some of our most renowned social justice leaders have experienced and endured solitary confinement and have shared with us some quotes that I'd like to share out now. Nelson Mandela once said, "I found solitary confinement the most forbidding aspect of prison life. There is no end and no beginning." And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Those were the longest, most frustrating and bewildering hours I have lived. Solitary confinement was brutal. You will never know the meaning of utter darkness until you have lain in such a dungeon." And I want to just open it up to the panel to reflect on each of those statements, which we find as time goes on that as we quote people, it starts to lose meaning. And I'm wondering if you can give some color to what that actually means in the context of your learning and experience in this space. Allison, could I start with you?
Absolutely. I mean, they are really powerful quotes from enormously significant leaders. For me, as someone who has traveled throughout the United States and met hundreds of people who've been subjected to the torture of solitary confinement, one other human, because these are human beings we're talking about, one other human that stays with me was a young person who, when I met him, he had been isolated in a supermax facility for 2 years, had had nobody visit him. And I had to fight to be able to meet with him. Eventually I was allowed in. And what he said to me was something so simple, but I think it's in the quotes that were shared. He just said, "I've had no human contact." He said, "I remember the last time anybody touched me was when somebody shoved a food tray through a slot in the door and their hand just grazed against mine." And I could tell he was almost clinging to that moment, even though it wasn't really a moment of connection or humanity. But it was something that he needed just to try to maintain his humanity. I also remember young people that we've interviewed at Human Rights Watch who talked about, I mean, we're talking about cement bunkers with concrete slabs for people to sleep on. I remember a young person describing just trying to talk to the walls, to have someone to talk to, but they're talking to a wall. So those are some of the sort of human realities that were brought to mind for me when these quotes were shared. I also think it's just so profound that some of the rules that have been established internationally are named after Nelson Mandela. And so it is a marker of course, his leadership, but also just what he endured, that we've been able to see some hopeful limits on this practice in international standards.
Well, that's a great segue, Allison, because I wanted to turn our attention to what this looks like internationally. And if I could lean on Juan a bit to share with us more about what this looks like in other parts of the world. When we think of rule of law and human rights violations, we don't often think of the United States as being at the top of any list, but this is certainly an example of where we are leading the charge on violations of human dignity.
Well, I think internationally people are gratified that there is an active attempt to regulate and outlaw solitary confinement in the United States, as exemplified by the campaigns that we're looking at. That there are states that are legislating this to eliminate the worst aspects, at least, of solitary confinement. For example, Mississippi abolished solitary confinement for juveniles now more than 10 years ago. And that's not enough. Of course, we need to go further. But it's very important that it's happening. And the Nelson Mandela rules are beginning to have some impact. For example, Ireland abolished from its prison regulations any form of solitary confinement in 2017, right after the Nelson Mandela rules were adopted. I know of some other examples that are going on, and there's also litigation. The Inter-American Court on Human Rights is about to have a hearing and then a decision on the use of solitary confinement in federal prisons of Brazil, for example. That is also very excessive. It's limited to a much smaller number of persons affected by it, but it is very horrendous practice. Unfortunately, it's not enough to have the Nelson Mandela rules. We need to push for implementation of the Nelson Mandela rules. And if it means by legislation, we have to advocate for legislation. If it is by court action, we need to get courts to say this is unacceptable. Already 2 justices of the Supreme Court in the United States, unfortunately, both of them are no longer in the Supreme Court, but they have called attention to solitary confinement and the need to look into it from a legal constitutional rights perspective. And of course, President Obama called on the need to look into solitary confinement before he left office. So we need to get these voices heard even stronger. And of course, we need to have action, policy action, judicial action, legislative action, and we need to start training corrections officers, officials on the prohibition. It compromises the international standing of any country to engage in torture. And to engage in torture, then call it something else, it is even worse. People, if countries resort to euphemisms, or even like it happened to me once in a debate at the BBC, a corrections officer from California said, no, it's not torture because if something goes wrong, we just take the person out and we take them to be given medical attention, and also because we talk to them. And that's why we were insisting that what the definition requires in order to avoid being torture is meaningful social contact. I mean, the fact that guards come and talk to you is not enough. This meaningful social contact cannot be ameliorated, for example, by letting you have a television set in your prison cell or having books to read. There is a need to implement the prohibition by allowing people to have several hours a day of social contact with their peers. In this case, is with the other general prison population. And yes, there are security measures that need to be taken care of, but if the only security measure is isolating somebody and making him or her talk to a wall, that is unacceptable.
I appreciate you raising that this is often framed as a security measure or something that advances public safety when we know that depriving people of meaningful human interaction really makes us all less safe. And hearing from you and Anissa makes me think about how this is often actually not used as a security measure. It's often used to debase, to retaliate, to discriminate. And we've certainly seen examples of that, not just in our big criminal legal system, but in its companion system of torture and humiliation, which is our immigration system in the United States. And I'm wondering if Allison can start the conversation for us on what solitary confinement looks like in the immigration context.
Definitely. On any given day in the United States, there are some 30 to 40,000 people held in ICE immigration detention facilities. These are facilities that look no different from prisons. They are lockups. They are secure facilities that are constructed like prisons. And the people held in them are people who are not citizens of the United States. Actually, occasionally there are citizens of the United States erroneously held there, but for the most part, they're not citizens. Some may have a criminal history. Many have no criminal convictions. And they're undergoing immigration procedures in immigration courts. These facilities use solitary confinement. They sometimes call it something else, and my co-panelists have talked about the different euphemisms that are sometimes utilized. But immigration detention is a place where people are locked up in isolation. I remember one example, it will never leave me. I was in a immigration detention facility in Texas, and I was on a tour, an official tour they were providing me because I had asked to visit the facility. It took me a long time to get in, but eventually they allowed me in. And you would think in such an instance, the guards would have wanted to be on their best behavior. But for some, and I can only call it a sadistic reason, they thought it would be entertaining to take me through what they called the administrative segregation section. And there, I am not a doctor, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I believe I was witnessing people in various stages of mental health crisis. It was horrifying. The screams, people just kind of throwing themselves against the walls. And I was shocked that the guards that were giving me the tour were laughing. So the dehumanization that solitary confinement involves is happening to the human beings who are locked up in immigration detention facilities and of course in all kinds of facilities in the US. I think it's also happening to the guards. And this is only occurring to me just now to state it, but I think it's probably true. Groups like Human Rights Watch have done investigations of the use of solitary in immigration detention. And it's quite difficult to put a number on it. But one really important investigation found about 8,000 people were held in solitary confinement over a 5-year period in the United States. So while I was citing the example of people with mental disabilities or in a mental health crisis, it's obviously happening to all kinds of people in immigration detention. It's also happening to children. Not necessarily in ICE facilities, because ICE doesn't hold people under the age of 18, but ICE does send children, sometimes immigrant children, again, non-citizens, into state juvenile systems. And in those systems, as we've talked about earlier on this panel, young people under the age of 18 are held in isolation. They're locked up alone in their rooms for 22, 23 hours a day. So it's a pervasive problem in the immigration system as well as in the criminal legal system in the US.
I sometimes find myself wondering whether our collective tolerance for this as Americans would continue if the people who were disproportionately affected by this practice weren't immigrants, weren't people of color, weren't folks who have already been disenfranchised in other ways. And being in Washington, D.C., where our jails are almost entirely Black, it's hard to ignore the racial undertones of what we allow to happen to our neighbors and children. And I'm wondering if anyone else can speak to the role of race and immigration status in how solitary confinement has become such a pervasive practice in our country.
Well, in my most recent task for the United Nations, I was a member of what's called the Expert Mechanism on Law Enforcement and Racism. And I visited United States jails. I mean, our focus was not detention centers. The focus was on police racism and impact on mostly or with focus on the people of African descent. But we did visit county jails in Los Angeles and in Chicago. And we were denied access to Rikers Island by a last-minute decision of New York, the mayor of New York. But in Los Angeles and in Chicago, we were able to see the predominance of people of African descent, not only in jail, but in actual conditions of solitary confinement. Because, for example, someone was taken for court hearings to the county jail and then had to wait for the actual hearing to happen, and sometimes spent literally months waiting for a court hearing, and all that time was spent in solitary confinement by whatever name they gave it. And we were struck by it. And although, as I said, our report was not based so much on, it was not focused on prison conditions, we did include in our report that was published in 2023 that there was significant race factor in who is determined to be put in solitary confinement.
If I can add something, in the community, we know there's a massive research that Black people, Latinx people are more often stopped and frisked by the police. They're more often proportionally arrested. They more often are convicted with very low level legal assistance because they don't have any money. And then they're given longer sentences. Does anybody expect that process? That's racism. Does anybody expect that to stop once people get to prison? So the truth is that disproportionately, Black people make up 45% of prisoners and only 13% of the population. Then in prison, they're more heavily represented in solitary confinement. And one mechanism among many for that is the use of force. I have seen correction officers, white correction officers, for instance, in Mississippi, where something like 60 to 90% of the prisoners are Black, and officers have KKK tattoos on their wrist while they're interacting with prisoners in solitary confinement. Use of force is another part of the torture. This is all going on in secret. We don't know what's going on in these units. People are beat up indiscriminately, just like on the street. Black citizens are beat up and shot. But in prison, they have a special procedure called a cell extraction, where a team of 5 or 6 officers, they get suited up in what looks to me like ice hockey uniforms with padding all over and a face mask and gas. They shoot immobilizing gas, pepper spray, into the prisoner's cell when the prisoner, for instance, refuses to return a food tray because there's insects in the food and he wants to show it to somebody, so he doesn't return it. They say, okay, that's a no, and they go and they assemble what's called an extraction team. one of them has a shield, and there's 4 other people all dressed like ice hockey players, and they immobilize him with immobilizing gas, and then while he's coughing and unable to respond really, they rush in all at once, and each officer is assigned to grab a leg or an arm. They push him against the wall with a shield, and of course this is a beating, and serious injuries occur, and this happens all the time. Well, there's such a thing as police discretion, and it goes on in the prisons. So if there's any degree of racism, and there's a lot of racism in staff in correctional settings, it's Black people and Latinx people who are going to get the brunt of this kind of torture. So that we need to add on to the ways in which the isolation itself is torture, as we've been speaking about. But then the use of force is excessive and just multiplies the torture.
I have to just chime in and add another population that I think is disproportionately affected by all of this as well. And I'm thinking about my experiences in immigration detention as a starting point, because there you have Indigenous people. You have Indigenous people locked up who actually, some of them do not even speak Spanish. They speak their Indigenous languages, and some of the disobedience that it's called that happens in immigration detention is because people can't communicate with them or with each other. It doesn't just happen to Indigenous people, it happens to a lot of people in immigration detention. But it also brings to mind the Native American population in US prisons, who themselves are also disproportionately incarcerated and also subjected to solitary confinement. So I think that's another aspect of the way that racism feeds solitary confinement in the US.
Absolutely. Thank you for that example. One theme of our conversation today is how much of this torture is happening in darkness. And I think one set of images that really shocked our collective conscious in the last 10 years or so are photos of children in cages, although that's something that happened before, happened since. And I'm wondering if I can learn more from each of you about how youth are affected by solitary confinement. Is it the same analysis when we're figuring out what level of isolation or duration of isolation we should tolerate for children as opposed to adults?
Can I just chime in and say, none. There should be no level of isolation for children. Because if you want them to develop, and I know Dr. Cooper will speak to this, right? You want them to develop mentally, emotionally. You don't isolate them. That is total torture. How do you expect a child to learn, to grow, if they're in total isolation? It just, oh, my brain just goes crazy when I hear the impact that it has on children, right? I look at immigration during COVID, when they had all of those babies in those cages, separated not only from their loved ones, but separated from other children so they couldn't socially interact. You know, Allison, you just said it, the language barrier, right? Like, children need to be able to speak and to be nurtured by another human being. Like, there should be no level of acceptance for any child. Anyone, they say 18, I say under the age of 25. Because I have a 25-year-old, a 28-year-old. But I say this, if he did not have me and the rest of my family and be in contact with us, where would he be? He would not have developed in the way that he is today to be the young man that he is. And then we got to remember, not only immigration, but our children who comes back to our communities with all the psychological trauma that isolation causes. And then we're supposed to help them to develop. But they're already at a stage where they can no longer learn to develop in a way that will be productive for their lives. So yeah, there's no level of acceptance for children in isolation. None. And I'll continue to fight for that until the breath is out of me. No isolation, no solitary for any child. And I still say a child is under the age of 25. They're still growing and developing.
I can't tell you. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Coopers.
Oh, well, I just want to second what Anissa is saying. We have brain research. The Miller versus Alabama was a Supreme Court case about giving life without parole sentences to juveniles, and the Supreme Court ruled it can't be done. The American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association, and National Association of Social Workers filed an amicus brief where they reviewed brain studies showing that the brain of adolescents, and Anissa is until the age of 25 on average, is not fully formed. If the right educational, social, emotional intelligence, if the right programs are not supplied, the opportunity is lost. There's a critical window during adolescence to develop social skills. And if you put the children in detention and then in detention put them in isolation, you're depriving them of social learning, of actual education in classes. And it's very likely it's going to have lasting effects, partly because the changes in the brain that happen because of the stress of isolation are long lasting. And that actually makes the psychological, the behaviors more long lasting because the brain is different. And then you have the problem of recidivism, that actually putting someone in solitary confinement in youth detention, which happens much more frequently than with adults. Kids are put in rooms or out of community more often than adults are put in solitary confinement. And that basically destroys their capacity to become socially functioning, creative, productive human beings.
Thank you for mentioning recidivism, because one of the things I appreciated so much about Anissa's answer just now was that you really illustrated what is common sense to all of us when we're not in the fog of thinking about systems of punishment, which is that there is such a thing as over punishment. There is such a thing as punishing a child so much that their behavior doesn't get better, it gets worse. And we should even selfishly want children's behavior to improve so that we can live in safer communities. And that sometimes gets lost in sort of the bloodlust of people wanting to punish after harm has occurred. And I'm thinking about how irrational the nexus between solitary confinement and what it purports to aim to achieve is. And I'm wondering if we can turn our attention to how is this legal? How are we living in a country where we have, pretty clearly articulated federal laws and amendments to our Constitution that say we're not supposed to engage in cruel and unusual punishment, that say we're not supposed to deprive people of these rights and dignities that we've been talking about today? How is it possible that this is happening and that it's so widespread and so tolerated under the law?
So I was trying to unmute. I'm sorry, it took me so long to respond to that. But when you said that, I just thought my mind went straight to the 13th Amendment and how it states this can happen only to incarcerated people. And so they use that to their benefit. And so for me, it's how do we then change that and remove that out of the 13th Amendment? Because this is where I hope and believe that this torture will then stop.
The 13th Amendment is critical. I agree. There's lawsuits all over the country in various states making forced involuntary labor in prison illegal. And several states, including Colorado, have a state amendment to the Constitution that includes people who have been convicted of a crime. The 13th Amendment said slavery is illegal unless you've been convicted of a crime. And indeed, our prisons are the continuation of slavery into the present, including the severe racism. And people are forced to work in work that is unhealthy, that teaches them no skills to use when they get out of prison. And we have to change that. I think I'll stop there for the moment.
Juan, could I hear from you about the role of attorneys and law students in this fight for something better in the near future?
Well, first, when the United States signed and ratified the Convention Against Torture, the Senate included an understanding that for the United States, cruel and unusual punishment in the Constitution means the same as cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment in the Convention. And in fact, the cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment is the absolute minimum that is affected by solitary confinement, even when it's not, prolonged or indefinite. But but of course, if it goes beyond, and unfortunately, there's so many examples of, states that engage in prolonged and even in indefinite solitary confinement, that there's no question that becomes torture. But whatever, even if it doesn't become torture, but we agree that it is cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, that's an absolute prohibition anyway. I mean, it's not that some things are allowed and some things are prohibited. I would also say that from the perspective of crime fighting, it's also very counterproductive to use this kind of regime in prisons. And I can only think of an example that I've heard over and over again of someone in the state of Colorado that was taken out of solitary confinement directly into into freedom because he had finished serving his term. And the first thing he did, he went to the house of the director of corrections of Colorado and murdered him. So we are actually doing ourselves a very bad service if what we want is to make our cities safer and our streets safer and our fellow citizens safer. We are really shooting ourselves in the foot by doing this. In terms of what can be done, I mean, unfortunately, I think others in the panel have much better experience than me on that. But I do take advantage of every opportunity to act as an expert witness on the international standards, like I did in the class action litigation in California that settled the case and got a very significant reduction of solitary confinement in California prisons. But of course, the litigation was done by others with more experience in litigation and sometimes with the support of students. What I do think is that law schools are ready and law students especially eager to find opportunities to participate in this kind of fight from the perspective of using their skills as lawyers or lawyers to be. And it would be important that we start enlisting them on this because the task is enormous. And even though we're now talking to the converted amongst ourselves, we need to do a lot more in terms of advocacy, in terms of public communication, in terms of lobbying for legislation, and just basically reform.
I totally agree. I participate in lawsuits because that's what I happen to be trained and have an opportunity to do. And so I do it the best I can. Lawsuits are only part of the picture. I think lawsuits allow us to get in and look around. The court orders the prison or jail system to let in the experts. And then we go in and we see what's going on, and we come out and we talk about it in court. In court, there's an equation that's very troublesome, and that is you need to weigh the value of solitary confinement in terms of safety and the smooth running of the institution versus the human harm it does. That equation is wrong on both sides. Solitary confinement does not help with safety or with lowering violence. All the research is the opposite. And if you reduce solitary confinement, all the research thus far has shown that the incidence of violence throughout the jail or prison system goes down, which disproves that it's helping with the safety. But the real problem is that it's destroying people. I call it the decimation of life skills. It's ridding people who are in solitary for a long time of social skills they need to get along peacefully with other people when they get out. And that's why it raises the violence. But over on the harm side, what the state does, and it's very cynical, is that I say so-and-so has a serious mental illness that's being exacerbated by solitary confinement. And that's obvious to me. I've practiced psychiatry for nearly 50 years. The state's expert will say the person is faking. They're malingering. And I tell them, you should really write a paper about that. Here's someone who has a diagnosis of schizophrenia. They've been on medication. They've been in and out of mental hospitals all their life. They come to your prison and suddenly they don't have a mental illness. You should write a paper about how you've magically cured them. Schizophrenia does not go away. It follows a waxing and waning course over a lifetime. If someone with schizophrenia, and they're more likely because people with mental illness are more likely locked up today in the United States, there's more people in prison by 10 times over than in our psychiatric hospitals. In prison, they're going to be put in solitary confinement, which is going to make their mental illness much worse. So getting back to the equation the courts use, you have to weigh the usefulness of solitary to provide safety and smooth functioning in the prison versus the human harm. The human harm is massive. Without even thinking about security issues, it should be disallowed because the human harm constitutes torture. And on the other end of the equation, it doesn't help with safety in the facilities.
Thank you so much for underscoring that point. I think it's really important as a key takeaway from today that people understand that if we reduce the use of solitary confinement, we're not just safeguarding the humanity of the people who are affected by it, we are making our communities safer by doing that. And so if you're really serious about safety and security, you would be part of this movement to end torture. And you all were invited here, not just because you know a whole lot about a whole lot, but because you are part of this movement. And I would love to talk a little bit about that. The movement to end solitary confinement has been growing over the last several years. And in 2018, there were about 53 bills pending nationwide to place limits on this practice. In 2023, there were over 150 bills introduced. And there is a federal bill that was introduced in the House and Senate last year called the End Solitary Confinement Act. In 2024, a law was passed in New York City that will fully ban solitary beyond 4 hours. And we are building momentum, we are building traction, and we are going to find ourselves at a tipping point where it is unacceptable to be in a state that is not taking serious action to limit the use of this horrific practice. And I want to ask each of you to share a little bit about why you're in that movement and what's in store for people who are here on World Social Justice Day looking to get involved.
Well, in my case, I think by using comparative analysis of what happens in other parts of the world, including countries that are allies of the United States, I hope that that can bring a sense of, the universality of the right to dignity that every person has, including every person who is incarcerated, and how other states are managing this evolving standards in international law that I've been talking about. Uh, but I think as we continue to press very hard for legal reform, we also need to continue to monitor the implementation. For example, the Holt law in New York State and in New Jersey that was so welcome because they actually seem to implement the Nelson Mandela rules in New York and New Jersey. I understand that it's not, they're in either state fully effective. They're not, that they're finding ways of kind of circumventing the prohibitions. And I don't have documentation on it, but I think we need to be aware that legal reform is important, but the implementation is more important than legal reform.
I'm just going to jump right in because, Juan, you said it. Thank you so much for saying that, because as someone who has worked on both levels, at our city level and at our state level, to get these laws passed, I work harder on the implementation.
Yeah.
And we are working harder to use implementation for people to better understand by even pulling out definitions of what out of cell time looks like, right? And legislating that, like giving people the language that they need to understand that this is real important work that's being done. And I do it because I see the detriments of solitary confinement every day in my city and state, right? And so I tell people all the time, and being the national coordinator, I talk to other states and I express to them, yeah, getting legislation, getting it passed is great. But the real work comes in when it comes to implementation, making sure that every state's Department of Corrections is following the letter of the law. Even if it comes down to what we're doing right now in New York, in our state, we've separated what out of cell looks like, sounds like, and definition is, and legislating it so that they'll know that people must get at least 7 full hours of programming out of their cell, and what it looks like to be out of a cell and in a congregate setting with other human beings, so that socialization is not lost. So this is what we're doing. And you said it, like the implementation is the strongest part of any legislation. And this work will not end for ANISA until all states have implemented the no use of solitary confinement on any human being in any form or fashion by any name. And I'll stop there.
I love how
Hear,
clear
hear.
and absolute that was.
I
Go
did
ahead, Alice.
too. I did too. It really was so rousing the way you put it, and I couldn't agree more. And I think, what's become clear from this conversation is the fact that, we at Human Rights Watch think all these tools have to be used. We've got to litigate the individual cases so people like Dr. Cooper's can get into the facility, so I can get into a facility and see what's going on. We've got to bring justice to the people who have been subjected to this practice. And we've got to pass the state and federal reforms to eradicate it because it is torture. I sit in California. This state has tried twice to pass the Mandela Act. Unfortunately, Governor Newsom has vetoed it both times, or one time vetoed it, the other just refused to sort of let it go forward. That act needs to come back again. It didn't do everything, but if it had passed, it would have prohibited the use of solitary confinement for people with specific vulnerabilities. Pregnant people, we haven't talked about that very much, but pregnant people are subjected to solitary confinement. The Mandela Act would prohibit any solitary confinement in California for people who are pregnant. People with physical and developmental disabilities couldn't be put in isolation. And the act, again, doesn't go far enough to total prohibition, but it would limit isolation for other people to no more than 15 consecutive days, which again, I think shows the work of Juan Mendez and the important standards that have come through the international system, and that also is having impact. The last thing I want to say about the movement for change, though, is I think we've talked about in many different ways how incarceration itself leads to isolation. So the bigger picture here is, why are we locking up so many people? Why are we putting them in mandatory immigration detention facilities? Why are we locking up young people convicted of offenses before the age of 18 in adult facilities where they're going to spend decades, even the rest of their lives, in solitary confinement? So it has to start with questions around policing and what is the point of using punishment in this way? Because, as Patrice, you put it so well, why are we using violence to solve violence?
I totally agree with Allison. The United States has 5% of the world's prison population and 5% of the world's population, and 25% of the world's prison population. Why are we doing that? What's wrong with our democracy? I want to add a footnote, and that is that the Mandela rules are part of the United States rules, because groups like the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare, which is the accrediting body for correctional health services and mental health service, has adopted the Mandela rules in its standards. The prisons and jails are not following the standards, but it exists here in the United States. For me, the problem is that it hurts me to see oppressed people being tortured. I mean, when I see a black man being beaten on the street by the police, it's painful. It hurts me in my chest. And I get stuck there. My career has gotten stuck in prison. And that is that I have seen sort of the most horrible human rights abuses I've seen anywhere, I've seen in the prisons. And I just cannot leave the subject. I have to speak out. I have to do something. And that has guided my career.
We're so grateful that it has. We're so grateful that it's guided all of your work and that you've been in this movement with the level of tenacity that we got to see on screen with you today. I hope that everyone who's watching will feel as inspired as I do to take part in this national action for meaningful change, that they'll all visit endtorturenow.org to learn more, that everyone will visit Unlock the Box Now on social media so that they can see not only how much work there is to do, but how much work lies behind us, and how bright the future ahead of us really is if we all band together. This is a moment where people are feeling a lot of hurt, and it is really our responsibility to galvanize support for those things that we know to be most intrinsic to our shared values. And I can't think of a better example in 2025 than working on solitary confinement and ending torture in the United States. The work that we've done in Washington, D.C. around solitary confinement has proven to be some of the most challenging work that we've done. And it's because it takes a real education effort for people to understand what would we do instead of solitary confinement. And I wanted to ask each of our panelists, what are the alternatives to solitary confinement that people need to understand exist?
Well, I know that I've dwelt a lot on the Nelson Mandela rules and on international standards, and it looks like they're all very negative. You can't do this and you can't do that. But obviously the alternative is imprisonment with certain hours of the day dedicated to meaningful social contact. And that of course is the alternative, the immediate alternative. But as in many other things, the prohibitions also have a positive side to that. That meaning that, of course, it's the duty of the state when it incarcerates people to provide them with all the opportunities for rehabilitation. And rehabilitation is denied by solitary confinement. I should say also that the Nelson Mandela rules after 2015, they also have some very important new rules about medical care and health care for people incarcerated. And the main rule that I always remember is that the person incarcerated has a right to the medical attention, and includes of course psychiatric attention that is available in the community. The rules for the federal rules for corrections in the United States say that that the person who is in solitary has the right to the attention that is available in the prison. That is that falls under the international standard. What's available in the community is what's available in the next hospital that you can take someone to be treated. And so at the very least, international standards also provide for alternatives. And if taken seriously, those alternatives would make solitary confinement not only prohibited, but also unnecessary.
I'm
think,
done.
please go ahead.
I'm just going to say I agree so much with everything that Juan just said. He kind of took the words right out of my mouth, right? Really, if there was a way that our systems could focus more on rehabilitation rather than punishment and punitive, then solitary wouldn't exist. Because for an altercation, if we took the two parties and sat them down in conflict resolution, we would solve the problem. So it wouldn't be a problem, right? People would be able to socialize and work together and learn together versus being isolated and tortured separately. So the alternatives are to provide that type of programming that people can then say, okay, we got into an altercation, let's go get conflict resolution, let's work through this, but then also providing different types of educational and vocational programs that would keep people's minds focused on the outside, not on what's happening on the inside, not isolated where you have to talk to a wall, right? But to be able to help to develop the individuals into the people that they're supposed to be. So yeah, I'm gonna stop there because I know we're running out of time, but there's a whole lot more I could say about the alternatives and what should be in place. And those are the fights that I'm fighting right now, is to make sure that people who are incarcerated, who actually get a charge inside, have the access to that out of cell time, that rehabilitation, those alternatives that can help better address the behavior that got them in there in the first place.
Well, I totally agree. And I think we've begun the important discussion by just mentioning alternatives. There's a mindset in corrections today that there is no alternative, that these people are the worst of the worst, and the only way to handle them and keep the prison safe is to stick them in a hole, which is solitary confinement. That's actually very far from the truth. Most people in prison went into prison for crimes they did as a teenager. I talk to them when they're in their 30s, 40s, whatever. They've taught themselves. They're autodidacts. They've gotten college educations. They've studied law. They've pressed their own lawsuits. And I ask them about their life, and they say, I was a kid. I was a stupid kid. I was running around on the streets doing drugs. I did something. I really regret it. But I've spent 30 years in here, and they've been breaking me. They've been punishing me. They've had me in solitary. So in order to end solitary, as Mr. Mendez said, we have to strengthen rehabilitation. The first requirement is radical decarceration. We imprison too many people, and unfairly, racial discrimination all over the place, homophobia, all kinds of problems. We need to reduce the prison population. One of the reasons, and it's only a small one, is that crowding causes violence in the institutions. And therefore, instead of fixing the problem would be fixed by reducing the prison population and supplying adequate rehabilitation so that every prisoner has something he would not or she would not want to forfeit by getting in a fight or something like that. So there needs to be radical decarceration, which requires sentencing reform, alternatives to incarceration, building up our public mental health system. We've broken it down since the late 70s. We have to build it back up and supply treatment. It's also considered torture to deny mental health treatment to someone in severe need of mental health treatment. So there needs to be radical decarceration. We need to build up rehabilitation and mental health treatment. That is being done all over the country. North Dakota is a prime example. And what they have done is followed certain policies that were developed in the Norwegian correctional system. And that is they do intensive rehabilitation and they reduce the population in solitary by a huge number. And guess what? The violence rate in all of North Dakota's prisons goes down as a result of decreasing solitary and building up rehabilitation. I add radical decarceration, which has to go on at the same time. And then I think we're moving in the right direction.
I agree with everything that's been said. And I just wanted to chime in with one thing that came to mind when you asked the question, what's the alternative to solitary confinement? And what popped out immediately for me was just the phrase, human dignity. If people were treated in a way that respected their human dignity, that's the alternative. And the other piece that I think Dr. Cooper's and really everyone was speaking to is that also creates a kind of virtuous cycle, because if people are treated in a way that respects their humanity, then if we have to lock people up, and as Dr. Cooper says, we should be locking up far, far fewer. So much incarceration is unnecessary and needs to end. But if people must be locked up and they're treated with respect for their human dignity, the concerns that some correctional officials seem to be expressing about behaviors in prison would be unwarranted. And in fact, I've talked to correctional officials who say exactly this. There are correctional officials who understand that if you treat people well, the entire system works better. So I come back to the alternative to solitary confinement is treating people with respect for their human dignity.
I love these answers. Thank you so much. One way of thinking about alternatives to prolonged isolation and torture is to think about how we separate people in other circumstances. This is not a timeout or a short cooling off period for people to be able to interact with each other healthily again. This is a period of time that is designed to break people down physically, mentally, and spiritually and leave them worse off individually and therefore worse off collectively. And so when we think about what alternatives to solitary confinement could look like, it includes separating people without torturing them. There are ways to resolve conflicts. There are ways to cool down heated situations that do not amount to permanent harm for the people who are involved. I often think about when I hear people ask, what's the alternative to police brutality? What's the alternative to mass incarceration? What's the alternative to solitary confinement? It's everything we're doing for people who have resources at their disposal. There are communities in our city, communities in our country that have virtually abolished all of these forms of brutality and torture. And everything that they have instead is what we all deserve to share and thrive together utilizing. So I really appreciate you all weighing in and making clear that this isn't a necessity and we can do better and must do better than torture. I would like to make sure that everyone who's been watching this presentation knows exactly how they can get involved. There are so many ways to plug in to this growing movement to end torture in the United States I want to invite everyone to pay attention to the social media channels for Unlock the Box Now, for Human Rights Watch, to visit End Torture Now and see how you can sign on and take action to demand change from people in decision-making positions. There are ways to engage with the organizations that are doing this work at the state level and working toward a federal bill to end torture in our federal facilities in the US. Please take the opportunity to see where you can get involved, where you can learn more, how you can share information with other people who might want to better understand the magnitude of the problem and their power to make a difference in this moment. I want to thank all 4 of you for sharing your expertise with us on this panel, and thank you even more for the work that you've done to lead you to that expertise. It is really in gratitude that I leave you here today. Just such an enormous debt for all that you've done and all that I know you'll be doing until this fight is won. So thank you so much. Appreciate you and look forward to the fight ahead together.
Thank you.